The church in Wellesley Village in downtown Toronto has long been known in the gay underground as a relatively safe space to meet and hook up. After an uprising by LGBTQ residents and regulars in 1981 in what's been called Canada's Stonewall, openly gay establishments began operating and enjoying success in what was now being called just the Village, a neighborhood and social hotspot where LGBTQ folks could feel accepted and safe. But as more and more gay men began disappearing and the local police force treated their cases with apathy or downright hostility, the residents and regulars of the Village began to realize their sense of safety was only an illusion. Let's get into it. Hi, and welcome to my channel. To my subscribers, welcome back, and thank you so much. I really appreciate you spending time with me. If you're new here, my name is Delaney. I'm a true crime writer and big-time murder nerd. On this channel, I talk about some of the worst human beings on the planet, and I tend to cuss a lot. So if you're into that sort of thing, go ahead and subscribe. If not, that's cool. You do you. Now, let's get into the story of Bruce McArthur. And I'm going to ask your forgiveness right up front because I know I'm probably going to mispronounce some of these names. Anyway, our story begins in the church in Wellesley Village in downtown Toronto, usually just called the Village. Like many gay districts in cities across the world, it's home to coffee shops, restaurants, bars, and dance clubs, as well as some residential areas. It's also the site of Canada's largest Pride Festival. One of the Village residents was Skandaraj Navaratnam, a 40-year-old Sri Lankan refugee who'd worked as a landscaping apprentice. He was well known in the Village and well liked. So when he went missing in early September 2010, leaving behind a new puppy in his apartment, his friends immediately reported him missing. Then, a little more than 2 months later, in late December, 42-year-old Abdulbasir Faizi was reported missing by his wife. Unlike Navaratnam, Faizi was still deeply in the closet, leading a double life with a wife and 2 children. His abandoned vehicle was later found by some family members in Toronto, but no other evidence turned up. Almost 2 years passed until late October 2012, when 58-year-old Majeen Kayhan, an Afghan immigrant who was also married and living a double life, went missing. So in November, the Toronto police created Project Houston to investigate these disappearances. For the next year and a half, they interviewed dozens of witnesses, canvassed the community, and searched the internet. They came to believe that Navaratnam at least had been killed. And at one point, they thought he might have been a victim of Luca Magnotta, the don't fuck with cats killer. Unfortunately, there was no evidence to prove or disprove this theory. And by late April 2014, all the leads had gone cold and no new evidence had been found, so Project Houston was shut down. But then in August of 2015, another man went missing. 50-year-old Sarush Mahmoudi, an Iranian refugee, was reported missing by his family. Like the others before him, he led a secret gay life, and like them, seemed to have just vanished without a trace. The rest of 2015 and all of 2016 passed without any more reports of missing men. But then in April of 2017, 44-year-old Salim Esen, a Turkish immigrant, was reported missing. Again, police could find no evidence of what had happened to him. But then, 2 months later, in June of 2017, 49-year-old Andrew Kinsman went missing. Kinsman was different than most of the other missing men. Besides being white, he was out as a gay man and had strong ties to the community. He was reported missing within 72 hours of his disappearance. And though there had been rumors and fears circulating in the Village before this, when Kinsman went missing, the gay community seriously started thinking that a serial killer was in their midst. Many of them still remembered the last time their community had been terrorized by a serial killer. From 1975 to 1978, 14 gay men had been killed. Most of them had been bound and beaten, arred, and stabbed to death, and their killer still has never been found. Anyway, in 2017, The Toronto police dismissed the idea of a serial killer, at least publicly, but a criminology student named Sasha Reed noticed that there were some strong similarities in these disappearances. All her research indicated that this was the work of a serial killer, so she brought her concerns to the police. In response to all this public pressure, Toronto police formed a new task force to find the missing men, this time called Project Prism. A search of Kinsman's digital record showed that before he went missing, he had connected with a 67-year-old man through Recon, an online dating app for gay men interested in BDSM. The man's name was Bruce McArthur, a burly landscaper who often worked as a mall Santa for the holidays. After doing some background research on McArthur, police found out that he had been banned from the village in 2003 after he was arrested for severely beating a male sex worker with a metal pipe. The man had lost consciousness and needed several stitches and weeks of physical therapy to recover. McArthur had pled guilty to charges of assault with a weapon and causing bodily harm and was given a conditional sentence of just under 2 years. He spent the first year under house arrest, followed by a 6-month curfew and 3 years of probation. He was also barred from the village. Then in 2013, a man had come forward to police claiming that McArthur had tried to strangle him during an otherwise consensual date. But the man later decided not to testify, probably out of fear or shame, so charges were never filed. The following year, McArthur had his record expunged. Police also discovered that Navaratnam and Kahan had worked for McArthur's landscaping company. In 2013, the same year he had allegedly tried to strangle that other man, he had been questioned about his relationships to the two men, but he denied any knowledge of where they were. Without anything else tying him to the missing men, and his only arrest for that attack on the sex worker being expunged, he was never even considered a suspect. But now there were enough red flags that police put him under surveillance and began gathering more info about him from the residents and regulars in the village. At first, everyone who knew him described him as friendly, kind, and even-tempered. But in private, apparently, he was very different. Several men who had hooked up with him for consensual BDSM sex told police that he had ignored their safe words and had choked or suffocated them into unconsciousness. Stories that were very similar to the one told to police in 2013. As they dug further, they uncovered ties McArthur had to several more of the missing men besides Navaratnam and Kahan. Faizy's car had been found near a property where McArthur worked. 2 of the men, including Kinsman, had connected with McArthur through Recon. In fact, McArthur had active profiles on multiple gay dating apps where he said he was interested in submissive men, preferably of Middle Eastern or Southeast Asian descent. Meanwhile, the search for Kinsman continued. In searching his apartment, police found the word Bruce written on Kinsman's calendar for June 26th, the last day that anyone had seen him. And on that same day, surveillance video outside Kinsman's apartment briefly showed a person who looked like Kinsman approach a red 2004 Dodge Caravan. The problem was there were more than 6,000 similar vehicles registered in Toronto. But only 5 of them were registered to anyone named Bruce, and only one of those was an exact match to the year, make, and model of the minivan in the surveillance footage. That one van was registered to Bruce McArthur. Police were able to track the minivan to an auto parts store where McArthur had sold it. After searching the vehicle, they found trace amounts of blood, which would later be identified as Kinsman's. They also found a coat with what would later be identified as Mahmoud's DNA on it. Then on January 18, 2018, undercover police who were surveilling McArthur saw an unidentified man arriving at his apartment. Fearing for the man's safety, they immediately raided the apartment. Inside, they found the man was handcuffed to the bed, but unhurt, thankfully. Chillingly, police later found a file on McArthur's computer with that man's name on it, alongside files for 8 other men. In each of the folders were photographs of the men in bondage gear, as well as pictures taken after the men had been killed, their bodies posed with cigars and fur coats. Police were able to identify 6 of the missing men, including Kinsman, in the photographs. Police also found a notebook that had belonged to Essen, as well as some jewelry that clearly wasn't McArthur's. McArthur was arrested and later charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Essen and Kinsman. While he was in custody, police searched the properties where he worked, especially one particular property where McArthur had made a deal with the owners to let him store his tools and equipment in their shed in exchange for free landscaping work. As crime scene technicians and cadaver dogs searched the garage and property, they spotted some large planters. Inside those planters, they found dismembered human remains. First, it looked like these were the remains of at least 2 men, but because they'd been dismembered, it was hard to know exactly how many individuals were in the planters. As they searched, they kept finding more sets of remains. Finally, by July, the remains of 8 men were uncovered. They were eventually identified as Kinsman, Navaratnam, Essen, Kahan, Faizi, and Mahmoodi. They also identified 2 other men, 37-year-old Karushna Kanagaratnam, a Sri Lankan asylum seeker whose application had been denied. He'd been living in Canada illegally ever since, so his family never reported him missing because they assumed he was in hiding. Police believed he had been killed in January of 2016. The other man, 47-year-old Dean Lisselwick, had been killed in April 2016, but because his struggles with mental illness had landed him on the streets, he hadn't been reported missing either. The jewelry that they had found in McArthur's apartment was later identified as belonging to him. McArthur was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. On January 29, 2019, he pled guilty to all 8 counts. The following month, he was sentenced to life without possibility of parole for 25 years. After his arrest, there was widespread criticism from the LGBTQ and Southeast Asian communities as to how the Toronto police had handled this case from the beginning. Much like in the Jeffrey Dahmer case, critics said police ignored the concerns of the community that there was a serial killer in their midst. Critics said the missing persons investigations were, quote, infected by bias and that there were, quote, serious flaws in many of them. Some in the community alleged that it wasn't until Kinsman, who was not a person of color, was reported missing that the police took any serious interest in the case. There were also allegations of racism and victim blaming by the lead detective in Project Houston. Community organizations called for an external review into the handling of these cases, the result of which was released just last year in 2021. The report concluded that systemic discrimination was a major factor into how the missing persons cases were handled. Quote, the effect of differential treatment on communities traditionally over-policed and under-serviced. The report called for, quote, truly transformational change into how investigations are handled, including over 150 recommendations, such as more civilian oversight, staffing, community involvement, training, and ways to address bias and discrimination. Specific recommendations include the requirement for police to regularly provide information about missing persons cases to those affected and to not erect unnecessary barriers to giving out that information. The report also calls for police to use the mandated case management system as required, as well as doubling the size of the missing persons unit and creating positions that would provide support for those directly affected by those disappearances. It also proposes a new investigative model which would involve managing cases in a more holistic way that could sometimes see social service agencies, public health agencies, or community organizations take the lead rather than police. The systemic bias exposed by that report makes up a big part of why pride is so important. Remember, this was not ancient history. This was only 4 years ago. And right now in the United States, the Supreme Court is striking down abortion rights with the excuse that they aren't part of our history and traditions. This ruling will open the door to striking down the rights that the LGBTQ community has fought so hard for and only recently won. Pride isn't just about rainbow merch and parades. It's about demanding equality and the right to live openly. And as the Bruce McArthur case shows, that can mean the difference between life and death. Keep up the good fight, Darklings. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more true crime. If you'd like to help me make more videos like this, consider supporting me on Patreon, where you can get early access to videos, bonus content, and free Murder Nerd merch. The link is in the description.